Greetings, everyone, and welcome to CAE Forum. My name is Anastasia, and I will be your host for today. Real quick, can I get everyone to type in the school where they're from in the chat window? We kind of like to see where our audience is coming from. So I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes to type in your guys' schools just so we can kind of see where you guys are at. Also, before we start, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. All of your mics have been muted, and you will not have video sharing rights. So if you have a question, please type it in the chat window. Also, please note that the presenter may not address your question until the question and answer portion of today's CAE Forum. So today I'd like to hand things over to Michael Hamilton.
Hi, everybody. So it looks like I have control of the screen. Here's what I'd like to talk about today. I know that there is some interaction between NSA and the Department of Homeland Security. And I want to talk a little bit about the way the Department of Homeland Security looks at critical infrastructure. And I want to contrast that with my experience as somebody who's worked a lot with local governments. So just in terms of my background, I have at various times been an IT security policy advisor to Washington State, advising the governor through the office of the CIO. I was the chief of information security for the city of Seattle for about 7.5 years. I was vice chair of the State, Local, Tribal, and Territorial Government Coordinating Council, which is one of the part of the critical infrastructure protection ecosystem of DHS. And prior to all that, I was the managing consultant for VeriSign's Global Security Consulting. So I bring a good breadth of knowledge and a lot of context to my comments today. So let's just dive in right here. And I don't seem to be able, there we go, there's my arrow. Okay, so what I'm gonna talk about today, government's a target. I think we all know that. I think we see that we've escalated from a place where organized crime was the biggest cyber issue. Hacktivists, certainly insider threats, those are all extant. But nation states now poking other nation states, and the collateral damage that follows, or the intentional damage that follows, is now a bigger deal, and that makes government squarely in the sights. Local government is the least protected of anyone, and there's reasons for that that I'll dive into at the end of this presentation. I want to talk a little bit, and I'll start by talking about the impacts. Records breach, theft of funds / extortion, and disruption of critical services. I think there's a lot of emphasis on the first one of those, records disclosure. That sucks all the air out of the room, but I think we can see just with a cursory examination of the news recently, there are no records left to steal. And we really got to quit thinking about a social security number as being this holy thing. Here's the bad outcomes. So loss of protected records. And the reason that I package things this way is this is an interesting and useful way to think about these outcomes. I've briefed a lot of elected officials, everywhere from mayors all the way to senators. And when you do that, you need to package things in a very understandable way. You can't talk about SQL injection and cross-site request forgery and buffer overflow because their eyes glaze over. But if you talk about a very simple taxonomy of bad outcomes and the financial impacts that are associated with those, you start to get attention. And conversely, if you are an influencer in an organization where you need to do things like drive budget, if you talk about dollar amounts of liability, it's a lot easier to have a conversation. So let's look at this, loss of protected records. Again, this is the thing that ends up in the news, sucks all the air out of the room. 48 states have data breach reporting acts, and everybody thinks this is the worst thing in the world. The financial impact of that is widely regarded to be somewhere around $150 a record. So if you have 1 million records in a customer billing database, you have a potential liability of $150 million. So let's have a conversation about spending $50,000 on some mitigating controls. That is a conversation you can have. So that makes that very useful. Electronic theft. So CEO impersonation is kind of the moniker that we give to this, or at least one way of doing this. I got an email from the CEO, said to wire away $50,000, so I did. Okay, well, that's theft. Ransomware is extortion and locking up your critical files or your customer database or in some way your ability to operate and then extorting money from you. That's not really it's theft, but it's extortion. That I would put into this bucket as well. Theft of intellectual property also goes in here. The dollar amounts that we can assign to this in my state, in Washington State, have ranged from $50,000 last week. There was a small jurisdiction near Kirkland, Washington that wired away 50,000 bucks, gone. Skagit Transit narrowly avoided losing $75,000. City of Burlington lost about $450,000 this way. Leavenworth Hospital, $1.2 million. That money doesn't come back. So you can start to put, again, financial bounds around all these things. And then there's infrastructure disruption. So if you're a business, it can be your ability to operate. And you will probably pay the extortion, or if it's an intentional disruption event like we've seen recently, you may just be out of business. But if you are in the public sector and the critical services that you run are 911, water purification, etc., the impact there could not just be a financial hit. For example, the cost of 3 days of emergency management to get a water purification plant back online. It can be up to and including loss of life. And what's a human life worth? You know, I don't think anybody but Boeing knows. Boeing knows because when planes go down, they need to assess what the fiscal damage of that is so that their team of lawyers can go to work mitigating those payouts. That is an astronomical number. So when we're talking about these bad outcomes, yes, loss of records is a real bummer. Dead people is a disaster. So let's just make sure that we all have kind of a good framing of this. And then there's the, you know, the bonus bummers, right? Additional regulatory scrutiny. You know, if you are in the public sector, your bond rating is going to fall. There can be fines from regulators, and it really ends up being a lot of money. So here's a few things that have happened recently in the public sector. You know, 911. You know, I commonly talk about this and frame this in terms of what we read in the news all the time. If Citizen Z loses his or her credit card information one more time and gets another letter from a credit card company saying that they're going to monitor your credit yet again, that's really annoying. But if your kid stops breathing and you call 911 and it doesn't work, that's the worst day you're ever going to have in your life. And that's a big difference. So here's a number of things that have happened in the public sector. I think the next one to the bottom was really interesting. This was school districts in the Atlanta area. And the threat actors added themselves to a payroll database and just started getting paychecks, which is kind of a brilliant crime. City of Inglewood, Colorado, when they were hit with ransomware, they A, paid the ransom, that cost money. B, they had to do the cleanup, that cost money. But in the interim, they were unable to take in revenue, and that's a triple hit. So when we're talking about, you know, your local government and the services that are provided, these kinds of little things, you know, that businesses may shrug off, can be horribly damaging. So here's what we're looking at the top 3 for state and local governments upcoming. Really the ransomware and the way that's evolved is going to be used for significant extortion. Why? Because organized crime is a business, and they will do what is least risk, highest return, and ransomware and these new variants that will encrypt an entire network and not a single asset are big money makers. And so these are the kind of things that they're going to do. So here's the way that DHS lines out critical infrastructure. And this is a great slide. I think I got this from the FBI some time ago, but the critical infrastructure sectors, and now we're down to 16, they're on that middle platter. You will note that for the most part, a these are held up by information technology. You know, you think about water, the water sector, right? The sector-specific agency for the water sector is the EPA, and the EPA regulates nothing but water purity. There is no regulatory oversight for the foreseeable outcome of a destructive attack against a water facility. And that's a big gap. Again, it's, I think, a little bit of a misplaced focus. But the interesting thing here is that middle platform of critical sectors that are actually a part of local government. Not all local governments, okay? So the dam sector, for example. Our power in the Pacific Northwest largely comes from hydro, and that's dams. And those dams are controlled by government. Transportation sector. Let's get into a little bit of these things here and talk about this. Traffic management. Traffic management is all IT. You probably don't know this, but as you're driving your car down the road, there are very many cities that are tracking the MAC addresses that are thrown off of the Wi-Fi or the Bluetooth coming off of your phone and or car. And they're doing that to map traffic flow. And so there's an enormous amount of technology in terms of the field network that helps to manage all this traffic. There's also a traffic management center, and the traffic management center has control systems, just like a dam operation or an energy utility. They don't open and close dams, but what they do is they modify signal timing, signage, they monitor cameras and do all these things. So there's this huge telemetry network out there just for traffic management, and it's extremely vulnerable. And later I'll talk about some of the reasons I think are why that's so vulnerable. Water purification, okay, this is a screenshot from something called an HMI, a human machine interface. And these are in every water purification plant. This is the way they run. You will hear the term SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition. This is part of that SCADA. So this is how you get a visual representation of what's going on. This is all very tender software and hardware that controls all of these things, the opening and closing of valves, the injection of chlorine into water, and the mixing that goes on. There have already been events where water purification plants have been compromised, and the attackers had the ability to modify the chlorine injection. That's very bad. Waste treatment, even worse. Losing your credit card's a bad thing, but if your toilet won't flush for 3 days, that's really bad. There's not a lot of, again, regulatory oversight here. And this is, I think, one of the most significant vulnerabilities that we have. The water sector and its corollary waste treatment, and I would even say stormwater removal, all things that are done by local government, are incredibly sensitive to being hit with IT attack. All right, communication for law enforcement, public safety. So Homeland Security will tell you that the communication sector is AT&T, CenturyLink, and Comcast. And they work with the private sector nearly exclusively because there's this meme that says 85% of critical infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector. I don't know where any of that came from. Nobody can really substantiate that. But if you are looking at the ability to continue operating ATMs and the cell phone network, that's a big deal. But the ability of law enforcement public safety to get to your house when it's on fire is more relevant to you at the scale that you actually live than the news stories about ATMs being down. Next-Gen 911 is coming. Next-Gen 911 will take text messages, attachments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What could possibly go wrong? So we can see that there are a lot of services here that are operated by local government that are dependent on IT, and they are not very well protected. What happens when something goes bad is we have to drop into emergency management. So I was ESF2 for the city of Seattle. I was trained in the NIMS framework and understand the incident command system. But the fact of the matter is, nearly every EOC runs a tool called WebEOC. And if it's not there, everybody falls back to number 2 pencil, and that doesn't work as well when you're trying to run emergency management after a big event. So again, dependent on IT. There are a few jurisdictions, and City of Seattle is one of them, where the municipal government controls energy, largely generation and distribution, not necessarily transmission, right? Generation, transmission, distribution are kind of the 3 parts of the energy sector. Seattle City Light is one of those. And so when I was at the City of Seattle, I had an energy utility under my purview. And it is surprising how attractive energy utilities are to international threat actors and nation states. And then we start to get into the smart city concept. So automated metering is kind of the gateway drug for all of this. And this is now generally being deployed very quickly. In the past, somebody would come out to your house with a clipboard every 2 months, write down some numbers, and you would get a bill. Today, your meter will report back to the energy utility about every 15 minutes, I think is the frequency that they use. And so you have this network device on the side of your house that is in contact. It is part of a field telemetry network for an energy utility to automate this. So great efficiency tool, also a great vulnerability. And when this was all nascent and we looked very hard at some of the technologies that were going to be used, we found that they had not considered security at all in the manufacturing development of these products. Okay, here are a few incidents that actually happened at the City of Seattle that I'll tell you about. So an HVAC system compromise. There was an HVAC system, and this was not the City of Seattle, but this was somebody who called me about this. They got a brand new CD from the manufacturer, inserted the CD, upgraded the software, and as soon as they did, the HVAC control platform started to send spam. And the spam was addressed as if it was sourced from yahoo.tw, the Taiwanese Yahoo. And it was only a period of time before yahoo.tw got blacklisted. It was not just this one HVAC system. This was happening all over the world. The take-home message there is, it's probably China that did it, not surprising. But the bigger take-home message is that the manufacturer itself was compromised, and therefore the CD that they sent out to upgrade software for their HVAC control systems was all part of this network. That was a big event. Power marketers. Power marketers have nothing to do with billboards. Power marketers are the individuals that negotiate trades of energy over the grid. And because Seattle City Light is an energy utility, we had power marketers. And what we saw was some suspicious intelligence briefs come in. We caught them. They didn't go anywhere. But we looked at the distribution of recipients, and they were primarily in Seattle City Light. And I went and talked to the CIO and said, what can you tell me about these? And he said, most of these are power marketers. And when we studied this carefully, we saw that one of the addresses that was used was the instant message address for the lead power marketer, the supervisor, that had been aliased to the email address internally. So how did these threat actors know the instant message address of the power marketers? Well, it turns out that some time ago, China hacked Google. And this was a big story in about 2009. Well, Google makes their own power. They have power marketers. And when China hacked Google, they lifted that information and then methodically started to go through the power marketers on the West Coast. And at least on the West Coast, that's what we know. And the reason the instant message address was used is because the tool used for negotiating trades of energy over the grid in the Western US, and I'm not making this up, at the time was AOL Instant Messenger. And so we tracked that back and gave the FBI our theory, and they said, winkety wink, we can't confirm that. So we had a piece of energy utility infrastructure that was compromised so badly. We think it was BIOS compromised at the BIOS level. We sent it back to have it examined by FBI forensic analysts and never got it back. Lots of denial of service attacks. There was a period of time when Seattle PD was, shall we say, above the fold a lot. And every time that happened, Anonymous would level the denial of service attack. Transportation management. I know that there are back doors built into the firmware of some cameras that are used across the United States, and the manufacturer will not fix the flaw. Their solution is upgrade your cameras to our newest model. Telephony equipment compromised. There was a piece of, I think it was Avaya technology, and we turned it on and it immediately beaconed out to China. Why? Because Avaya had 2 domains that they were using for automated updates so that these would beacon out and say, you have any updates for me? They let the domains lapse. China picked them up, and every time these were fired up, they would reach out to China and say, what do you got for me? All this happened, and this was, I can tell you, a real education in, again, where our focus is and is not in this infrastructure protection ecosystem, specifically regarding IT security. Okay, so how do we get here? So number one, government and local government in particular manages by landmine. We don't fix something until the problem is so obvious that somebody's in danger of being excoriated in the newspaper, right? That's the thing that elected officials at the local level fear the worst. Thin budgets and poor value proposition. It's very hard to say you need to invest in security. There is no return on this investment that we can really measure, but you really got to do it. And that's just that's a hard sell. No access to qualified practitioners. Right now they are in short supply, expensive, and extremely difficult to maintain. This is my favorite one, is technology moves faster than policy. And I have a picture here of a stingray. And this is, I think, a good example of what I mean by technology leads policy. Law enforcement in particular has access to lots of grant money. And they can go out to trade shows and conferences and find all this great surveillance tech that helps them in their mission of identifying criminals that are planning things, selling drugs, robberies being planned, things like this. That's great. But what they do is they buy all this stuff and they put it to use before anybody knows about it. There is no public policy around this until they get caught. And then all of a sudden, city council or county commissioners will get into the act and they will finally put some policy around this. That's backwards. We need to have policymakers that are tuned in enough to what technology is doing to be able to create good public policy prior to these technologies being used. But I still think more than anything, it's our misplaced focus. It's this idea that the public sector is not this, and especially local government, is not a big target. And if something happens, it's not going to be a big impact. And hopefully I've been able to dispel that a little bit. This is not a big private sector problem. At the scale of your real life, this is really a local government problem. So is this something that we can legislate our way out of? There are attempts to do this right now. So the region that I am in right here, I am on the west side of Puget Sound in Bremerton, Washington. And this is Navy Town. This is Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. There are a variety of naval installations around here. This is the highest concentration of military anywhere in the United States. Our Congressman, Derek Kilmer, wrote the bottom bill along with some co-sponsors. These are all good efforts. None of them are really moving forward in Congress. So if there's anything I could ask you to do, it's to please advocate for these things to move forward. If we can create a block grant program for states to go out and look at where the risk areas are around their own jurisdictions, their state jurisdictions, and work on resilience planning, and then have an implementation phase where they can get some assistance out to local governments, we can start to address these things and close up these vulnerabilities that are very liable to end up in that loss of life term. So that is the end of my presentation. I want to be available for questions for as long as we can work together on this. At the bottom here, you see you can sign up for the IT Security News Blast. Every day I put out about 20 curated articles. You can also just go to our site and see them. I'm on Twitter. The company's on as Crit Informatics. I'm Seattle MKH. That's where you get my real opinions. Would love to meet you, and I guess we'll open this up for questions now. And let me check out, I think, Anastasia, you're going to run the Q&A, yeah?
Yes, I'm going to run the Q&A. So let's see what we have on the Q&A. So far, I'm not seeing any questions. Does anybody have any questions for Michael?
I think David's question, why not, that was with respect to why, right, yeah, why are the bills not moving forward? I think it's because there's no political will to take this up. Again, management by landmine, if we have a forcing function, a really bad event, that probably is what it's going to take our legislators to really get serious about this stuff. I know that Representative Kilmer's bill has not dropped, and that was, I know I helped work on this, and it's probably been close to a year where the text of the bill was formally set and it was ready to drop. But without enough co-sponsors that think this is an important issue, you know, and remember this is a budget hit, right? I mean, money's got to come from somewhere. I think, you know, there's, in this Congress in particular, there's a real reluctance to spend any money on a lot of things that don't, I'm going to choose my words very carefully here, that don't promote continuing election success. Let me just say that.
Okay, we have another question from David Alata. Why aren't these bills moving forward?
That was the one I just answered.
Oh, okay. And then I have a guest that's raising their hands, so I'm guessing they called in via the line. So I'm going to give you a chance to speak real quick. Hold on.
Cybersecurity insurance will play in perhaps driving manufacturers as well as operators toward a more secure investment in their infrastructure. In my view, I think the insurance industry is more likely to be driving whether it's ad hoc regulatory policy or just overall investment, because nobody wants to pay a high premium if they can't secure their infrastructure.
Yes, a very good point. And let me just respond to that. So I have been a presenter at some conferences of risk managers, which is essentially people that are involved in the insurance industry and risk management functions in private, for the most part, private sector organizations. And if you study what insurance companies actually insure, of those three buckets I talked about, only records disclosure. There's very few insurance companies that will insure anything but records disclosure. And if you go back to my comment about there are no records left to steal, unauthorized disclosure of protected records is a foreseeable event. Why would anyone insure against rain in Seattle, a foreseeable event? It makes much more sense to insure against a hurricane, a low frequency, high impact event. So in a perfect universe, it's not the insurance companies that are driving this kind of investment, it's the other way around. So if I do good risk management and I identify some risks that are connected to vulnerabilities, there are four things I can do. I can accept the risk, just say, okay, we know it's there, right? The 1979 Ford Pinto model of risk management. We know they blow up, we'll just pay people off. You can avoid the risk. You can turn off that Windows 2003 server or upgrade it. You can mitigate that risk through the application of controls. That's where investment is required. Or you can transfer that risk through insurance. That's the four ways to deal with it. If you mitigate risk so that typical threat actors, and the way I think of it is in terms of a taxonomy of threat actors, and I can get my risk bar high enough to where hacktivists are not going to be that big of a problem. Organized crime, we kind of have that under control. You are never going to raise the risk bar so high that a nation state with nation state level tools would not destroy you if they wanted to. That's the hurricane. And so in my view, that's the way it ought to be done. I don't know that that answers your question. That's my feelings on the insurance industry. I think right now they're feeding in a trough. They don't understand what they're doing. They've overinsured this, and if we have another global event like WannaCry or the NotPetya event, where there's a lot of collateral damage, right? Let's remember that that was disguised to look like crime, but it was a destructive attack. That happens, and it's wide enough. The insurance companies are all in over their heads, and they don't have enough money to cover this. So some work needs to be done there.
Thank you for that perspective. I appreciate it.
You bet. That was a good question. Let's see. You want to lead these questions, Anastasia?
Yes. So we have a couple more questions. This one's from Bryson Payne. On the technical side, do you feel that we should be teaching our computer science, information systems, and information technology and cyber majors to protect critical infrastructure systems more, or is the policy change the more important focus for now?
Well, that's a terrific question. Bryson, I think both of those swim lanes are really important. I think in the education that people are wanting to get right now, I think it's really about protection. The policy focus, I think, is informed by cybersecurity professionals and practitioners, but I think it's best handled by public policy individuals in consultation with professionals who can talk about it. But let me just respond a little bit to protect critical infrastructure. So one of the things that we need to wrap our heads around is that protection is never going to be perfect. And so if you look at the controls, you know, if you've done like, you know, the CISSP training and taken the horrible 6-hour exam and all those things, you know that there are preventive, detective, and responsive controls. We need more of a focus on detection and response along with that prevention. And we put a lot of focus into the prevention bucket. But if we don't have a plan, and I'll give you an example. Here in Washington State, one of the things I helped work on with the military and state government, some other people, a lot of volunteers, was an annex to our comprehensive emergency management plan that said, here's what we're going to do in the event of significant cyber disruption. And it has to do with public-private partnership and the role of the military and governor's declaration and how does the Stafford Act apply and all of those things. Those are some things that we really need to be focusing on. I think prevention is not necessarily straightforward. It's moving along very quickly with artificial intelligence and machine learning and things like this. And that's great. And we want to know all those things. And we want to know the basics about prevention. But if we don't spend a little bit of time saying, okay, you know, preventive controls are going to fail, and then what? It's that then what, right? We have to be resilient. And resilient means you got to take a punch and get back up. So I would encourage more focus on detection and response along with prevention. Good question.
Okay, we have one last question here from David. Do you think the recent major hacks, Russia in the elections, Equifax, et cetera, will kickstart Congress and state governments to preemptively invest in security upgrades?
Maybe. That's what I'm hoping, you know, some of these bills will actually, you know, see the light of day and get moving along. I think it's really going to be around this idea of resilience. You know, we know these things occur. It's best if we can identify how we quickly get back up and get back operational. Do I think it's going to kickstart? If this is going to be a forcing function, I think that what it's going to force is more of an examination of how we treat our logical borders as an analogy to our physical borders. And let me explain what I mean by that. So if you want to come into this country, if you want to physically come into this country, there are standards you have to meet. There are behavioral norms. There's a lot of things there that you have to demonstrate to be allowed to come into the country. But our logical borders, there's no such thing there. And so what I'm hoping is we start to talk about treaties that would treat our logical borders like they treat our physical borders. If you can't maintain some kind of standard of behavior that we can all agree on. For example, if you look the other way and your country is full of organized crime that is stealing money from all over the world, and you're looking the other way because the sanctions hurt so bad that this is probably an income source for you, you're not allowed in our border. And our power is really in the economics around this. I could talk a lot about market-driven security and how we're starting to turn a corner and get there, but when we can use market forces, we have, I think, a lot better leverage. And so, it would hurt, and it would hurt on both sides. But if we said, okay, we are just not going to let any packets coming from Russia past our routers, you get a lot of attention. And I think that we would bring people to the table, and we would be able to start talking about things like treaties and behavioral norms, discussions that are not going anywhere right now. I think in terms of your question, what's it going to take to kickstart Congress and state governments to preemptively invest in security upgrades? I think it's going to take a landmine. I think it's just going to take that demonstration that, you know what? It's really easy to knock over traffic management and water purification and waste treatment and emergency management and radio systems for law enforcement and all those other things. And unfortunately, I think we need to see a bad outcome before Congress gets serious. That was a good question.
Okay, great. That about wraps it up for today. Thank you, Michael, for your wonderful presentation. Before I let you all go, I want to let you know that we are looking for presenters for CAA Forum in spring of 2018. So if you're interested, please email us at caaforum@caecommunity.org. I'm going to post that email in the chat box. Thank you all for tuning in, and have a great day.
All right, bye, everybody.